Tuesday morning started like any other at the San Diego military base. The California sun gleamed over the gray buildings, soldiers ran in formation, and the familiar sound of helicopters echoed on the horizon. The recruitment office buzzed with its usual activity: young men and women seeking purpose, career counselors processing paperwork, and the constant hum of military life continuing its relentless march forward. But in exactly 8 minutes, everything would change. A simple man of ordinary appearance would walk through those gates carrying something that would transform not just one day, but the lives of everyone who witnessed what happened next. This is the story of how a single moment of disrespect turned into 8 minutes that would be remembered forever, and how sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we never see coming. It's about the dangerous assumptions we make about people based on their appearance, and how 8 simple minutes can reveal truths that shake us to our very core. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about heroism, respect, and the price of service that some pay in silence. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance? Comment below. Thomas Ghost. Sullivan was 57 years old, with graying hair and weathered hands that told stories he'd never share. To anyone passing by, he looked like a maintenance worker, or perhaps a retiree taking his morning walk. His faded jeans, worn leather jacket, and quiet demeanor gave no hint of the 32 years he'd spent in the Navy SEALs, or the countless missions that had taken him to the darkest corners of the world. Ghost, a nickname earned not for his ability to disappear, but for how he moved through life without seeking recognition, had retired 5 years ago to a small apartment near the beach, where the sound of waves helped quiet the memories that sometimes kept him awake at night. He spent his days fixing neighbors' broken faucets, walking his old German shepherd named Ranger, and visiting the graves of brothers in arms who hadn't made it home. His neighbors knew him as the quiet guy who never talked about his past, but always showed up when someone needed help. They had no idea that the man who fixed their leaky pipes had once spent 6 months behind enemy lines, or that his weathered hands had saved more lives than most people would meet in a lifetime. Today, however, he carried something that weighed, heavier than any mission gear he'd ever shouldered: a perfectly folded American flag and a letter that would change everything for a family destroyed by grief and a system that had failed their son. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 28 years old and full of ambition, sat behind his recruitment desk with the confidence of someone who believed he knew everything about military service. Fresh from his second deployment and hungry for promotion, Webb had developed a reputation for his sharp tongue and quick judgments. When the older man in civilian clothes walked through the door, Webb barely looked up from his computer. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked with barely concealed impatience. Ghost approached slowly, his weathered face serious. "I need to speak with someone about Private Michael Rodriguez," he said quietly. Webb's eyebrows raised with annoyance. "Rodriguez? The kid who washed out of basic training last month? Look, old man, I don't know what your connection is to that failure, but..." Ghost's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "He didn't wash out. He died." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Webb was too caught up in his own arrogance to notice the warning signs. "Look, I don't know who you think you are," Webb continued, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that spoke of years of unchecked authority. "But I handle recruitment here, and I know every soldier who comes through this base. Rodriguez couldn't cut it. Simple as that. Kid was weak, couldn't handle the pressure. We see it all the time, dreamers who think military service is some kind of video game." Ghost reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness and carefully placed the folded flag on Webb's desk. The young sergeant glanced at it dismissively, not recognizing the sacred weight of what lay before him. "Michael Rodriguez died 3 days ago," Ghost said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that made nearby conversations pause. "Not in combat, not in training. He took his own life because he couldn't handle being told he wasn't good enough." Webb's face flushed red, but instead of showing respect or remorse, his arrogance doubled down. "Well, that's unfortunate, but it proves my point. The military isn't for everyone. We can't coddle every recruit who can't handle..." "You told him he was worthless," Ghost interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge that made the air in the room feel electric. "You told him he'd never amount to anything. You told him real soldiers wouldn't want him watching their backs. Webb stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. And I was right. Look what happened. Listen, old man, I don't know if you're his father or uncle or whatever, but you clearly don't understand how this works. This isn't summer camp. We don't hand out participation trophies. And frankly, you don't look like someone who'd understand what real military service looks like, either. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ghost looked down at the folded flag, then back at Webb. And for the first time since entering the office, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Michael Rodriguez was 19 years old, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had delivered too many eulogies. He came from a family of 5 kids in East LA. His father worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. His mother cleaned houses 12 hours a day. Michael was the first in his family to graduate high school, and he wanted to serve his country more than he wanted his next breath. Ghost picked up the flag, holding it with the reverence of someone who understood its true cost. He wrote to me every week during basic training, not because he was struggling with the physical demands. Kid could run a 6-minute mile and do more push-ups than most of your recruiting class. He wrote because he was struggling with sergeants like you, who mistake cruelty for leadership. Webb opened his mouth to interrupt, but Ghost continued, his voice gaining strength. You want to know what real military service looks like, Sergeant Webb? It looks like a 19-year-old kid writing letters to a stranger he met at his brother's funeral, asking for advice on how to be worthy of wearing the uniform. It looks like staying up all night wondering if you're strong enough, brave enough, good enough to stand with the heroes you've read about your whole life. That's enough, Webb shouted, his face now purple with rage and embarrassment as other personnel in the office began to turn and stare. I don't know who you think you are, coming in here and lecturing me about leadership. I've served 2 tours. I've earned my rank, and I don't need some civilian grandfather telling me how to do my job. His voice carried across the room, drawing the attention of everyone present. Other recruiters, administrative staff, and several officers had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. You're not a hero, Webb continued, pointing an accusatory finger at Ghost, his voice filled with venom. You're just another bleeding heart who can't handle the reality of what it takes to build real soldiers. The military isn't a charity case. For weak kids who can't cut it in the real world, Rodriguez proved that. And frankly, looking at you, I doubt you'd last 5 minutes in real combat yourself. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the phones had stopped ringing. Ghost stood perfectly still, the flag still cradled in his arms, his face impassive as a stone monument. But something had changed in his posture, something that made the air itself seem to thicken with tension. Webb, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, pressed on. Matter of fact, why don't you take your little flag and your sob story and get out of my office before I call security? We don't have time for civilians who want to waste our day with their complaints about how the big bad military hurt someone's feelings. He reached for his phone, ready to make good on his threat, completely unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his military career. Ghost finally spoke, his voice so quiet that everyone in the room had to strain to hear him. You want to call someone, Sergeant Webb? He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting a single card that he placed gently on the desk next to the flag. Call Admiral Richardson. Tell him Ghost Sullivan is here. The name meant nothing to Webb, but something about the way Ghost said it made several of the older officers in the room go pale. I don't care if you know some desk jockey, Admiral, Webb scoffed, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The point remains the same. You're not military, you're not a hero, and you don't belong here. Ghost nodded slowly, as if accepting the judgment, then did something unexpected. He smiled, not with humor, but with the sad recognition of someone who had heard those words before, in places much more dangerous than a recruitment office. You're right, Sergeant Webb, Ghost said quietly. I'm not a hero. Heroes are the ones who don't make it home. Heroes are 19-year-old kids who take their own lives because they believe what people like you tell them about their worth. He paused, looking around the room at all the faces now watching them. I'm just someone who spent the last 32 years trying to make sure heroes like Michael Rodriguez don't die for nothing. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of a phone ringing in the distance, a phone that, would change everything in exactly 8 minutes. Webb's phone rang, cutting through the tension like a blade. He answered it with his usual brusque confidence, but within seconds, his face began to change. "Yes, sir. What? Are you sure?" "Yes, sir, he's here." His eyes went wide as he looked at Ghost, then at the card on his desk, then back at Ghost again. "No, sir. I had no idea." "Yes, sir. Immediately, sir." He hung up the phone with shaking hands. The transformation was instant and terrifying. Webb's arrogance crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Sir, I didn't know. Admiral Richardson wants to speak with you immediately, and he's ordered—" Webb's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. He looked around the room, seeing for the first time the expressions on his colleagues' faces. Expressions of recognition, respect, and growing horror at what they had just witnessed. Ghost picked up his card and put it back in his wallet with the same careful precision he'd shown with everything else. "The choice was always yours, Sergeant Webb," he said quietly. "You could have chosen to see Michael Rodriguez as a young man trying to serve his country. You could have chosen to guide him, to build him up, to help him become the soldier he dreamed of being. Instead, you chose to break him." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. "Now you have another choice. You can choose to learn from this, or you can choose to repeat it with the next scared kid who walks through that door, looking for someone to believe in him." What happened next would be talked about on military bases across the country for years to come. Admiral Richardson's voice could be heard through the phone's speaker as Webb held it with trembling hands. "Sergeant Webb, you are in the presence of one of the most decorated Navy SEALs in American history. Master Chief Thomas Sullivan has more confirmed kills than most units, has saved more American lives than you will meet in your lifetime, and has spent the last 5 years of his retirement personally mentoring young recruits who were struggling with military life." Ghost stood perfectly still as the Admiral continued. "Master Chief Sullivan was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions so classified that most of the details are still sealed. He has 3 Silver Stars, 4 Bronze Stars, and more Purple Hearts than I care to count. The flag he's carrying belonged to Private Rodriguez, who reached out to him for mentorship after struggling with basic training. Master Chief Sullivan has been providing guidance and support to struggling recruits for years, completely voluntarily, because he understands what you clearly do not, that real leadership is about building people up, not tearing them down." The room was so quiet you could hear hearts breaking. Webb's face had gone from red to white to green as the full weight of his mistake settled on his shoulders like a crushing load. But Ghost's transformation was different, not physical, but spiritual. The quiet maintenance worker facade had fallen away, revealing something that made everyone in the room understand why his teammates had called him Ghost. Not because he disappeared, but because he carried within him the spirits of every fallen comrade, every saved life, every mission accomplished in shadows that would never see daylight. Admiral Richardson's voice continued through the speakerphone, each word hitting the room like artillery shells. "Master Chief Sullivan didn't come to your office to cause trouble, Sergeant Webb. He came because he promised a dying boy's mother that he would personally deliver his flag to the family and ensure that his sacrifice, yes, his sacrifice, would not be forgotten. Private Rodriguez may not have died in combat, but he died because of a system that failed him, and Master Chief Sullivan holds himself personally responsible." Ghost finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of service. "Michael wrote to me the night before he died. He said he was sorry for not being strong enough to be the soldier America needed. He said he was sorry for disappointing everyone who believed in him. He asked me to tell his family that he tried." Tears began to fall openly throughout the room as Ghost continued. "A 19-year-old boy apologized for not being worthy of a uniform that half the people in this country wouldn't have the courage to put on." Webb tried to speak, but no words came out. Around the room, officers and enlisted personnel began to stand at attention without being ordered to do so. Someone in the back of the room whispered, "Master Chief," and the title spread through the crowd like wildfire. Ghost shook his head gently. "I'm retired," he said quietly. "Today, I'm just a man trying to keep a promise to a mother who lost her son." But everyone in that room knew they were in the presence of something sacred, Not just a war hero, but a man who had chosen to carry the burden of others long after his official duty had ended. Admiral Richardson's final words over the phone changed everything. "Sergeant Webb, you should also know that Master Chief Sullivan specifically requested not to be identified when he began mentoring struggling recruits. He didn't want his reputation or his decorations to influence the process. He wanted to help these young people based purely on merit and need, not because of who he was. He's been doing this for 5 years, completely anonymously, and has saved more military careers than most officers achieve in a lifetime." The twist hit everyone like a physical blow. Ghost had been helping struggling recruits all along, asking for nothing in return, seeking no recognition, wanting only to serve in a different way. He could have walked into Webb's office and immediately commanded respect and attention. Instead, he had chosen to approach as an ordinary citizen, giving Webb every opportunity to do the right thing simply because it was right. Michael Rodriguez was his 7th mentee this year, the Admiral continued. The other 6 all graduated successfully and are now serving with distinction around the world. Master Chief Sullivan has been fighting a war against the very attitudes that you displayed today, Sergeant Webb, and until 8 minutes ago he was winning. Ghost looked down at the flag in his hands, and for the first time since entering the office, his composure cracked slightly. Not from anger or embarrassment, but from the crushing weight of failure. Despite all his experience, all his skills, all his dedication, he hadn't been able to save Michael Rodriguez from the cruelty of a system that was supposed to protect him. What followed was 8 minutes that redefined everyone's understanding of heroism, service, and sacrifice. The base commander arrived within minutes, followed by a delegation of officers who had served with Ghost during his active duty years. Outside, word had spread through the base like wildfire, and personnel began gathering in spontaneous formation. Not ordered, not commanded, but drawn by something deeper than military protocol. Webb sat at his desk, staring at the flag. Finally, understanding the magnitude of what he had done and who he had done it to. But more importantly, he was beginning to understand what he had done to Michael Rodriguez, a young man whose only crime had been wanting to serve his country while being vulnerable enough to be broken by casual cruelty. Ghost spoke to the gathered crowd through the office windows, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. Michael Rodriguez died believing he wasn't worthy of the uniform he wanted to wear. But the truth is, our uniform wasn't worthy of him. He had the heart of a warrior and the soul of a patriot, and we failed him. He held up the flag. This flag doesn't belong to the military. It belongs to every American who believes in the ideals it represents. Michael Rodriguez believed in those ideals, and they killed him for it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition, shame, and the beginning of change. In 8 minutes, a quiet man had reminded an entire military base what service really meant. Not the taking of lives, but the saving of them. Not the breaking of spirits, but the building of character. Not the exclusion of the unworthy, but the elevation of everyone willing to try. As Ghost prepared to leave, he turned back to Webb one final time. Michael Rodriguez was a hero, Sergeant Webb. Not because he died, but because he kept trying even when people like you told him he wasn't good enough. He got up every morning and gave his best effort, despite being told daily that his best wasn't good enough. He pushed through physical and mental challenges that would break most people, and he did it all because he believed in something bigger than himself. Ghost paused at the door, the flag still cradled in his arms. Real heroes don't get medals or recognition. Real heroes are the ones who keep showing up when everything inside them says to quit. Real heroes are the ones who believe in others when those others can't believe in themselves. Michael Rodriguez was that kind of hero, and we killed him for it. He looked around the room one last time. The question now is, what kind of heroes are you going to choose to be? The impact of those 8 minutes would ripple through the military community for years. Webb would eventually leave the service, dedicating his life to suicide prevention among young veterans. The recruitment office would implement new training programs focused on mentorship rather than elimination. And Michael Rodriguez's story would be told in military academies as an example of how leadership can heal or destroy. But perhaps most importantly, Ghost's example would inspire a generation of veterans to find ways to continue serving after their official duty ended, proving that real heroes don't retire. They just find new ways to answer the call. 6 months later, Ghost stood in Arlington National Cemetery. Not at Michael Rodriguez's grave, his family had chosen to bury him in his hometown, but at the tomb of the unknown soldier. In his weathered hands, he held a letter from Michael's mother, thanking him for keeping his promise and for making sure her son's story was heard. The letter also contained news that would have made Michael proud. His younger brother had enlisted, inspired not by his brother's death, but by the story of how a stranger had cared enough to honor his memory. The transformation that began in those 8 minutes had spread far beyond one military base. Videos of Ghost's words had circulated through military communities worldwide, sparking conversations about leadership, mentorship, and the true cost of service. Young recruits now knew that there were people like Ghost out there, quiet heroes, who would stand with them when the path got difficult. Webb had written his own letter, which Ghost also carried. In it, the former sergeant detailed how those 8 minutes had changed his life, how he had come to understand that true strength came not from breaking others down, but from building them up. He had started a foundation in Michael Rodriguez's name, dedicated to providing support and mentorship to struggling military recruits. As Ghost walked away from the tomb, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked 6 young men and women, his current mentees, people who might have become another Michael Rodriguez, if not for the lessons learned in those 8 transformative minutes. They walked with the quiet confidence of people who knew they were worthy, not because they were perfect, but because someone believed in them enough to help them become their best selves. The story of Ghost Sullivan and Michael Rodriguez reminds us that heroism isn't always found on the battlefield. Sometimes it's found in the quiet moments when someone chooses kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, building up over tearing down. It challenges us to look beyond appearances and assumptions, to recognize that the person standing before us might be carrying burdens we can't see, fighting battles we can't imagine, or offering gifts we're too proud to accept. In our own lives, we all have the choice that Sergeant Webb faced in those 8 minutes. We can choose to be the person who builds others up or tears them down. We can choose to see potential or focus on flaws. We can choose to offer hope or deal in despair. The power to be someone's hero or someone's destroyer lies in these small moments, these everyday interactions that seem insignificant but carry the weight of destiny. Michael Rodriguez is gone, but his story lives on as a reminder that our words and actions have consequences far beyond what we can imagine. Every interaction is a chance to be someone's Ghost Sullivan, the quiet hero who shows up when it matters most, who sees worth where others see failure, who offers hope when hope seems lost. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? Have you been that person for someone else? Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes the heroes we need most are the ones standing right next to us,